A pregnant woman stands alone in a courtroom. No lawyer, no money, no one on her side. Her billionaire husband laughs from across the room, surrounded by four attorneys. He has already stolen her savings, turned her friends against her, and convinced a psychiatrist she is losing her mind. He thinks he has already won. But what he does not know is that the judge watching from the bench holds a secret that will destroy everything he built. And the woman he underestimated. She used to put criminals in prison for a living. Stay until the end. The final twist will leave you speechless. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you love stories about justice, hit subscribe. The morning light filtered through silk curtains that cost more than most people earned in a month. Caroline Whitmore Harrington opened her eyes slowly, her hand instinctively moving to rest on the curve of her belly. 7 months pregnant, and every morning felt like waking up in a museum rather than a home. She turned her head to the empty pillow beside her. Preston had already left for his morning routine, probably in his private gym or taking calls by the infinity pool. The sheets on his side were cold, perfectly smooth. She wondered sometimes if he even slept there at all. Caroline pushed herself up carefully, her body protesting the movement. The bedroom stretched around her like a cathedral of wealth, all cream fabrics and polished surfaces. A Monet hung above the fireplace. Fresh flowers appeared on her nightstand every 3 days, replaced by staff she rarely saw. Everything was beautiful. Everything was chosen. None of it was hers. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and pressed the button. The screen stayed dark. She tried again. Nothing. Preston had disabled her notifications last month, claiming the constant buzzing was harmful to the baby. He had read an article about it. He said he only wanted what was best. The walk to the bathroom took longer than it used to. Caroline caught her reflection in the massive mirror and paused. The woman staring back looked tired. Not just pregnant tired, but something deeper. Her eyes had lost a certain sharpness she once carried like armor. 2 years ago, she would have laughed at this life. 2 years ago, she was Caroline Whitmore, forensic accountant, the woman who had uncovered a $12 million embezzlement scheme that made the evening news. She had stood in front of cameras and explained financial crimes in plain language. She had been someone. Now she stood in a bathroom larger than her first apartment, asking permission to schedule her own doctor appointments. The memory surfaced unbidden. A charity gala, the Hendricks Foundation annual event. She had been there representing her firm, explaining to donors how their money was being tracked. Preston Harrington III had watched her from across the room for an hour before approaching. "Carolyn Hahn," he had said, reading her name tag with a smile that felt like sunshine. "You make numbers sound like poetry." She had laughed. "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said about my work with spreadsheets." He had been charming, attentive, different from the men who saw her intelligence as a threat. Preston had seemed genuinely fascinated by her mind. He asked questions. He remembered details. When he looked at her, she felt seen. The courtship had been swift but not rushed. Expensive dinners where he listened more than he talked. Weekend trips where he asked about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. He proposed on a private beach in the Maldives, and she said yes because she believed she had found a partner, not a collector. Caroline splashed water on her face and gripped the marble counter. The woman in the mirror did not look like someone who had been collected. She looked like someone who had been slowly, carefully, systematically erased downstairs. Preston sat at the breakfast table with his tablet and a cup of coffee that their cook prepared exactly the way he liked it. He looked up when Caroline entered and smiled the smile she had once found irresistible. "Good morning, my treasure," he said, rising to pull out her chair. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," Caroline said. She sat carefully, accepting the herbal tea that appeared beside her plate. The caffeine restriction had come from Preston, not her doctor, but fighting about tea seemed pointless. Preston returned to his seat and swiped through his tablet. "I have adjusted your schedule for today," he said casually. The tone of someone announcing the weather. Caroline felt her jaw tighten slightly. "What did you change?" "I canceled your lunch with Dorothy." Preston did not look up. "You need rest, not gossip. She exhausts you. Dorothy is my oldest friend, and I am your husband." Preston finally met her eyes. His gaze was warm, concerned, perfectly calibrated. "I know what is best for our baby. Carolyn, that is all I want. A healthy baby. a healthy you. The words hung in the air like a gentle threat disguised as love. Carolyn nodded because nodding was easier, because fighting meant hours of circular conversation that always ended with her feeling crazy, because somewhere in the past 18 months, she had learned that silence was survival. Preston returned to his tablet. I have also arranged for a delivery from that boutique you like. Some things for the nursery. I thought you would appreciate not having to go out in this heat. Thank you, Caroline said automatically. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, his lips cool against her skin. I have meetings until 7, he said. Rest today? You deserve it. After he left, Caroline sat alone at a table set for 12. The silence of the house pressed against her like something physical. She could hear the distant hum of appliances, the whisper of the air conditioning, the absolute absence of anything spontaneous or alive. She had one errand Preston did not know about, a prescription refill her doctor had called in directly to her, bypassing Preston's carefully monitored medical schedule. Small rebellions, tiny proofs that she still existed outside his approved universe. At the pharmacy, Carolyn handed over her personal credit card, the one attached to an account Preston had set up for her incidentals. The card she used for magazines and lip balm and the occasional book he did not need to review. The pharmacist ran the card and frowned. I am sorry, ma'am. This card has been declined. Caroline blinked. That is not possible. There should be $50,000 in that account. The pharmacist tried again with the same result. Would you like to try another form of payment? Caroline stood frozen at the counter, her hands still extended, her mind racing through explanations. A bank error, a system glitch, something simple and fixable. But her accountant's brain, dormant for 18 months, was already calculating, already questioning, already afraid. I will come back, she said quietly. She drove home in silence, her hands tight on the steering wheel, the baby shifting restlessly inside her. By the time she pulled into the circular driveway of the Harrington estate, Carolyn Whitmore Harrington had made a decision. She was going to find out exactly where her money had gone, and she was going to do it without her husband knowing a thing. The study had always been Preston's domain. Dark wood, leather chairs, the faint smell of cigars he claimed to have given up. Caroline rarely entered without invitation, but Preston was across town in meetings, and she had 3 hours before the housekeeper returned. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the laptop she had retrieved from the bedroom safe. Preston did not know she had memorized the combination years ago. He thought she never paid attention to such things. He thought a lot of things about her that were no longer true. The household financial portal loaded slowly. Caroline entered her credentials, the ones Preston had insisted she have for transparency, and watched the numbers populate the screen. What she saw made her stomach drop. Her personal account, the one Preston called her Freedom Fund, showed a balance of $47. $47 from $50,000. Carolyn scrolled through the transaction history with the focused precision that had once made her career. Withdrawals, transfers, a pattern emerging like bruises under makeup. $15,000 to V. Caldwell Consulting, monthly, for 14 months. She did not recognize the name. She had never heard Preston mention any consultant named Caldwell. Her forensic instincts, buried under months of submission, began to sharpen. V. Caldwell. Carolyn opened a new browser window and began searching. Vivian Caldwell, executive assistant, Harrington Development Group, hired 18 months ago. Caroline stared at the employee photo. Blonde, polished, the kind of professional beauty that looked effortless but cost thousands. Vivian Caldwell had started at Preston's company 1 month after Caroline announced her pregnancy. The payments had started the same week. The math was simple. The betrayal was not. Caroline found herself breathing too fast. Her hand pressed against her belly as if protecting the baby from knowledge it could not understand. She wanted to scream. She wanted to call Preston and demand answers. She wanted to throw the laptop across the room and pretend she had never seen any of it. But she had spent years building cases against people exactly like her husband. She knew how this worked. Confrontation without evidence meant denial. Accusations without proof meant gaslighting. If she went to Preston now, emotional and unprepared, he would convince her she was imagining things. He would show her reasonable explanations. He would make her feel crazy until she apologized for questioning him. Instead, Carolyn began documenting. Screenshots of every transaction, dates and amounts transferred to a secure cloud account Preston did not know existed. The corporate filings for V. Caldwell Consulting, registered to an address that matched Vivian's apartment, $210,000. That was how much her husband had funneled to his mistress from her personal account. He had not even used his own money for him. He had used hers. Caroline closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of the study, her mind racing through implications. This was not an affair. Affairs were messy and impulsive. This was systematic, calculated. Preston had planned this like a business deal, moving money through channels designed to be invisible, which meant he was planning something else too. Something that required her to be financially dependent. Something that required her to have no resources of her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. "Hey, stranger. Miss your face. Coffee soon." Caroline stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Can you talk? Really talk?" The phone rang 30 seconds later. "Caro," Dorothy said, her voice warm but worried. "You sound different. You have sounded different for months. What is happening?" Caroline took a breath. "I think I am in trouble. Real trouble." The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Dorothy said, "Tell me everything." Caroline told her. The isolation. The schedule control. The way Preston framed everything as concern. The financial discovery she had just made. The payments to a woman named Vivian. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When Caroline finished, her friend exhaled slowly. "Caro, this is textbook. Everything you are describing, the isolation, the monitoring, the financial control, this is what abusers do. He has never hit me. Abuse is not always bruises." Dorothy's voice was fierce. "You were one of the smartest women I knew. You caught criminals. And now you are asking permission to see your friends. That is not love. That is ownership. What do I do? You get out, tonight. Come stay with me. We will figure out the rest later." Caroline wanted to say yes. She wanted to pack a bag and drive away and never look back. But she knew Preston. She knew how his mind worked. If she ran now, pregnant and financially compromised, he would spin the narrative before she could speak a single word. "I cannot," Caroline said. "Not yet. I need more proof. I need documentation he cannot deny. Otherwise, he will destroy me in court." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Then promise me something. Promise me you are copying everything. Every document. Every email. Send it somewhere safe. I promise. Be careful. Caro, men like him do not lose gracefully." That night, Preston came home with flowers. White roses, her favorite. He kissed her cheek and asked about her day with the attentiveness of a man deeply in love with his wife. "I have a surprise," he said over dinner. "I scheduled an appointment for you tomorrow. A specialist." Carolyn felt the temperature in the room drop. "What kind of specialist?" "A psychiatrist." Preston's voice was soothing. Reasonable. "I have been worried about your anxiety lately. The mood swings. It is completely normal during pregnancy. But I thought professional support might help." Caroline set down her fork carefully. "I'm not anxious." "Sweetheart," Preston said with a patient smile, "you have been withdrawn, paranoid, even. Remember last week when you thought the gardener was watching you?" She remembered. She remembered because the gardener had been watching her, reporting her movements to Preston. She had seen the text on Preston's phone by accident. "I think we should take this seriously." Preston continued. "For the baby." Caroline looked at her husband across the candle-lit table. White roses between them, and understood with terrible clarity what was happening. He was not just having an affair. He was not just stealing her money. He was building a case, documenting her instability, creating witnesses and evidence for something that had not happened yet. Preston was going to take everything from her, and he was going to make sure the world believed she deserved to lose it. The psychiatrist's office smelled like lavender and new leather. Harold Whitfield sat behind a mahogany desk with a notepad open in front of him, his expression professionally neutral. Preston had insisted on attending the session, claiming he wanted to provide support. Carolyn sat rigid in the armchair, her hands folded over her belly. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, but she had no proof, only the cold certainty growing in her chest. "Why do you not start by telling me what brings you here today, Dr. Whitfield said. Before Caroline could speak, Preston leaned forward. I have been concerned about my wife's mental state, he said. The pregnancy has been difficult. She has become withdrawn, suspicious. She accused our gardener of spying on her. Dr. Whitfield made a note. Is this true? Mrs. Harrington Caroline chose her words carefully. I observed the gardener taking photos on his phone while I was in the garden. I found that unusual. Preston sighed the sigh of a patient husband. You see what I mean? He was photographing the new landscaping for our files, completely innocent. Dr. Whitfield wrote something else. Any other incidents? She checks our financial accounts obsessively. Preston said, I found her going through records late at night. When I asked about it, she became defensive and secretive. Because you are stealing my money, Caroline thought. But she said nothing because saying it here, now without evidence, would only prove his point. The session continued for an hour. Preston painted a careful portrait of a woman unraveling, his voice dripping with concern. Every time Caroline tried to counter, her words sounded exactly like what a paranoid person would say. When they left, Whitfield scheduled a follow-up appointment. I would recommend weekly sessions, he told Preston, and perhaps some medication to take the edge off her anxiety. Carolyn walked to the car in silence. The trap had been set perfectly. She could see every piece now, interlocking like a puzzle designed to destroy her. That night, after Preston fell asleep, Carolyn made copies of everything: bank statements, Dr. Whitfield's business card, the appointment she had never agreed to. She sealed them in an envelope addressed to Dorothy and drove to a mailbox 3 miles from the house. She would not be caught unprepared. 3 days later, Preston came home early. Carolyn was in the study, her laptop open to the financial records she had been analyzing. She had not heard his car. She had not heard the front door. What are you doing? Preston said from the doorway. Caroline's blood turned to ice. Working on the nursery budget, she said. Preston walked toward her slowly. The mask he wore in public had slipped entirely. His eyes were flat, assessing, the eyes of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. You know about Vivian, he said. It was not a question. Caroline stood, her laptop between them like a shield. I know about everything. Preston smiled, and the smile was worse than anger would have been. You know nothing, he said, and by tomorrow, no one will believe a single word you say. He turned and walked out of the study. Carolyn heard him on the phone in the hallway, his voice low and urgent. She caught fragments. File tomorrow. Emergency petition. Mental instability. Danger to the child. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness of the guest bedroom, her hand on her belly, and waited for morning to reveal what her husband had planned. The envelope arrived at 7 in the morning. A courier in a pressed uniform handed it to her directly, requiring her signature. Inside were divorce papers, filed by Preston Harrington III. The grounds listed made Caroline's vision blur. Mental instability, erratic behavior, potential danger to the unborn child. Preston was not just divorcing her, he was declaring her unfit. She tried to call Dorothy. The number had been disconnected from her phone's approved list. She tried to access her bank accounts online. Frozen pending investigation. She walked to the garage for her car keys. Gone. Caroline stood in the kitchen of the house that had never been her home. 8 months pregnant, with no money, no phone access, no transportation, and no way to reach anyone who might help her. Preston had executed his plan with the precision of a military campaign. When he came home that evening, he found her sitting at the kitchen table. I did try to make this easy, Preston said, pouring himself a drink. You could have been reasonable, signed what I asked, accepted a settlement. You stole from me. Caroline said, you are having an affair. You manufactured evidence against my sanity. Preston swirled his whiskey. Prove it, he said. Prove any of it. You are a pregnant woman with documented mental health concerns. I am a respected businessman with a team of lawyers. He leaned against the counter. Who do you think a judge will believe? Carolyn felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, something harder. The last thread of hope that this could end peacefully. Then she felt the baby kick, strong and insistent, like a tiny warrior demanding she keep fighting. She looked at her husband with new eyes that were not beaten, eyes that were calculating. I guess we will find out, she said. The first catastrophe came within 24 hours. Carolyn had hidden emergency cash in a drawer beneath her winter sweaters. $3,000 saved from birthday gifts and small withdrawals over 2 years. The morning after Preston served her the divorce papers, she reached into the drawer and found nothing but cashmere. He had known. He had known about everything. Carolyn searched the room systematically, pulling out drawers and checking pockets. Every emergency she had prepared for, every backup plan she had constructed, Preston had already dismantled. Her secondary credit card was missing from her wallet. Her passport was gone from the desk where she kept it. Even the small jewelry pieces she might have pawned had vanished from their boxes. She was trapped in a mansion with nothing she could convert to freedom. The second catastrophe arrived by phone. Carolyn had managed to reach Dorothy using the landline, a number Preston had apparently forgotten to block. Dorothy answered on the third ring, her voice strange and tight. "Caro," Dorothy said, "I cannot talk to you." "What, Dorothy?" "I need help. You said you would help me. Men came to my hospital." Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "They said they were investigators. They had documents claiming I stole controlled substances. They said if I testified for you or helped you in any way, they would file charges." "That is not true, Dra. You never stole anything. I know that. You know that. But they have paperwork, Caro. Forged prescriptions with my signature? Forged. I could lose my nursing license. I could go to prison." Dorothy was crying now. "I am so sorry. I cannot risk my entire life. I have children." Caroline closed her eyes. Preston had gotten to her only ally, removed her one witness with surgical precision. "Dorothy," she said quietly, "I understand. Take care of yourself. I am sorry." Dorothy whispered again. Then the line went dead. The third catastrophe arrived by courier that afternoon. An official court document, stamped and filed. Dr. Harold Whitfield's psychiatric evaluation, submitted as evidence in the divorce proceedings. Caroline read the words with growing horror. Patient exhibits paranoid ideation, delusional beliefs regarding spouse's fidelity, possible danger to unborn child if left unsupervised, immediate recommendation for inpatient treatment. Attached was a petition for emergency guardianship. Preston was not just seeking divorce. He was seeking legal control over Caroline and over their baby. He wanted the court to declare her mentally unfit before she could even respond to the divorce filing. She sat on the floor of the bedroom that night, her back against the wall, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Everything she had built, everything she had documented, everything she had planned, Preston had anticipated and destroyed. For the first time since this nightmare began, Caroline considered surrender. She could sign the papers, accept whatever pittance Preston offered, walk away with nothing, and start over somewhere far from here. The baby kicked again, harder this time, almost painful. Caroline pressed her hand against the movement and felt something shift inside her. Not defeat, rage. Clean, clarifying rage that burned through the despair like fire through fog. She had spent her career catching men like Preston. Men who thought their money and power made them untouchable. Men who believed they could manipulate systems designed for justice. She had brought them down before with nothing but numbers and determination. She would do it again. Carolyn pulled herself up from the floor and walked to the guest room closet. In the back, behind a stack of old magazines, was a laptop Preston did not know she owned. A burner computer she had purchased with Hash during a solo shopping trip he had never questioned. She opened it and began to search. Legal aid organizations, pro bono attorneys, women's shelters that provided legal support, emergency resources for domestic abuse victims who had no physical bruises but plenty of financial scars. One name kept appearing in her searches. Bennett Shaw, a young attorney who specialized in family law cases involving financial manipulation. His firm offered free consultations for women leaving controlling relationships. Caroline stared at his contact information for a long moment. Then she typed an email that would change everything. "My name is Caroline Whitmore Harrington. My husband is trying to take my child and my freedom. I have evidence of financial abuse, but I have no resources to fight him. I need help." She pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she noticed something in her old email account. A message from years ago, forwarded automatically to her backup address. Her estranged father, Theodore Whitmore, reaching out on her birthday 5 years before. She had never responded. They had not spoken since she was 12 years old. since the day he packed his bags and walked out of their house without looking back. Theodore Whitmore, retired federal judge. Carolyn filed the information away and closed her laptop. Tomorrow she would find out if anyone was willing to help a pregnant woman fight a billionaire. Tonight she would rest. She would need her strength. Chapter 4. Word count 872 words. Running behind a total of 952 words. Status under target. Need to expand. Adding additional scene. Shot. The next morning, Carolyn woke to the sound of Preston's voice downstairs. He was speaking to someone on the phone, his tone clipped and businesslike. She crept to the top of the stairs and listened. The psychiatric hold should be filed by Thursday. Preston said, once she is admitted, custody becomes straightforward. A mother in treatment cannot be the primary caregiver. Caroline pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. I want this done before she can retain counsel. Preston continued, she has no money, no contacts. By the time anyone takes her seriously, the baby will be born and in my legal custody. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. Trust me. He said, she is completely isolated. She can hurt us now. Carolyn returned to the guest bedroom on silent feet. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. 72 hours. She had 72 hours before Preston tried to have her committed against her will. She checked her email. Bennett Shaw had responded, Mrs. Harrington, his message read, I have reviewed the public records you mentioned. What you are describing is a pattern I have seen before. It is called coercive control, and it is actionable. I would like to meet with you as soon as possible. My services are pro bono for cases like yours. Caroline typed her response. Can you meet today? Time is running out. His reply came within minutes. I will clear my schedule. Tell me when and where. For the first time in months, Caroline felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Bennett Shaw was younger than Caroline expected. Late 20s, with the kind of earnest face that suggested he still believed the legal system could deliver justice. His office was small, cluttered with files, and smelled faintly of coffee and determination. Mrs. Harrington, he said, rising to shake her hand. Please sit. Tell me everything. Carolyn had escaped the house through a service entrance Preston did not monitor. She had walked 2 miles to a bus stop and taken public transportation for the first time in 3 years. By the time she reached Bennett's office, she felt like a fugitive. She told him everything. The isolation, the financial control, the psychiatric evaluation designed to discredit her, the threat she had overheard about the involuntary commitment, the affair with Vivian Caldwell, the payments from her own accounts. Bennett listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her with something between admiration and concern. Mrs. Harrington, he said, I have seen this pattern before. Isolate, control, discredit. Your husband is not unique. He is textbook. Can we beat him? Bennett leaned back in his chair. Honestly, men like him rarely lose. They have resources, connections, lawyers who bill more per hour than I make in a week. He paused. But I have never met someone with your receipts. You documented everything. You have bank records, dates, patterns. That is more than most victims ever manage. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. I was a forensic accountant, she said, before I became a wife. Bennett smiled for the first time. Then let us use those skills to take your life back. They spent 4 hours building a case. Bennett helped her organize the evidence into a coherent timeline. He explained the legal strategies available and the risks of each approach. He filed emergency motions that same afternoon. The first motion requested the court unfreeze her accounts, citing financial abuse and the illegal seizure of marital assets. The second motion challenged the psychiatric evaluation as biased and requested an independent assessment. The third motion asked the court to dismiss the guardianship petition pending a proper hearing. When Caroline left Bennett's office, she felt something she had not experienced in months. Agency, control over her own story. For 72 hours, it seemed to work. The court granted the emergency motion to unfreeze her accounts. Carolyn was able to access enough money to secure a small apartment and retain Bennett officially. She was able to change her phone number and block Preston's access to her location. She was free. For 72 hours, she believed she had won. Then Preston's team produced the video. Bennett called her with the news, his voice grim. They have footage from Dr. Whitfield's office, he said. It has been edited to show you admitting to paranoid thoughts, taken completely out of context. Carolyn's stomach dropped. I was explaining that Preston made me feel paranoid. I was describing his behavior, not mine. I know, Bennett said, and we can prove the editing with forensic analysis. But that takes time, weeks, maybe months. The judge has reversed the order. Your accounts are frozen again. Caroline sat down heavily on the second-hand couch in her tiny apartment. The walls felt like they were closing in. There is more, Bennett said. Preston's lawyers are claiming you fled the marital home without cause. They are using your departure as evidence of instability. They say a rational pregnant woman would not leave a comfortable home for a studio apartment unless she was having a breakdown. The irony was so cruel it almost made her laugh. Staying made her look weak. Leaving made her look crazy. Preston had designed a trap with no exit. What do we do now? Caroline asked. We keep fighting, Bennett said. We find another angle. We do not give up. But his voice carried a weight it had not before. The confidence of their first meeting had dimmed. Caroline hung up the phone and stared at the wall of her apartment. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life. Inside, she was running out of options. The baby kicked, and she placed her hand on her belly. Not yet, she whispered. We are not done yet. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Caroline Uptamam. The voice was female, smooth, familiar. This is Vivian Caldwell. I think we should talk. Chapter 5. Word count 747 words. Running total 513 words. Status under target. Expanding chapter. Caroline's first instinct was to hang up. This woman had taken her money, shared her husband's bed, helped destroy her life. There was nothing Vivian Caldwell could say that Caroline wanted to hear. But something in Vivian's tone made her pause. A note of uncertainty that did not match the confident predator Caroline had imagined. Why would I talk to you? Caroline said. Because Preston is not who you think he is. Vivian's voice was lower now, almost a whisper. And he is not who I thought he was either. Against every rational instinct, Caroline agreed to meet. A public cafe, broad daylight, witnesses everywhere. Vivian was already there when Caroline arrived, seated at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Without her professional polish, she looked younger, tired, almost frightened. Caroline sat down without ordering anything. Say what you came to say. Vivian took a breath. I am not here to apologize. What I did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it. I told myself stories to make it acceptable. That your marriage was already over. That you did not appreciate him. That I deserved something good for once. Caroline waited. But I did not know everything. Vivian continued, I thought the money was his. I thought the plans were about divorce. I did not know he was going to try to take your child. Caroline felt her hands tighten under the table. And now you do know. He talks when he drinks. Vivian said. Last week he told me his plans. The psychiatric commitment, the custody filing. He wants full control of everything, including the baby. And once he has that control, he said he would not need me anymore either. So you are here because he is discarding you. Caroline said, I am here because I finally saw what he really is. Vivian met her eyes, a man who collects people and throws them away when they stop being useful. I was convenient. You were a trophy. The baby is a legacy project. None of us are real to him. Caroline studied the woman across the table. 2 months ago, she would have dismissed this as manipulation, but she had learned to recognize the particular exhaustion that came from loving someone who was not capable of love. What do you want from me? Caroline asked. To warn you, Vivian said. He has more planned. Things he has not filed yet, and I have access to documents that could help you. Why would you help me? Vivian's laugh was bitter. Because I finally realized something. If he could do this to you, his wife, the mother of his child, what makes me think he would not do the same to me eventually? She slid a flash drive across the table. Everything I could copy, she said. Emails, financial records, plans he thought were private. It is not enough to destroy him, but it might be enough to save you. Caroline picked up the drive and held it in her palm. Such a small thing to carry so much destruction. I should hate you, Caroline said. You should, Vivian agreed. But right now, we have a common enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is the only ally I have left. Caroline spent 3 days reviewing the contents of Vivian's flash drive. What she found was worse than she had imagined. Preston had been planning this for years, before they were even married. He had consulted with lawyers about the most effective ways to maintain control over assets in case of divorce. He had created shell companies to hide money. He had built relationships with doctors and psychiatrists who could be relied upon to provide favorable evaluations. The prenuptial agreement she had signed, buried in a stack of wedding paperwork she barely remembered reviewing, contained a morality clause that essentially stripped her of everything if she filed for divorce without provable cause. And the language was designed so that proving cause was nearly impossible. Preston had not fallen in love with her. He had targeted her. Her intelligence had attracted him because he wanted smart children. Her financial skills had impressed him because he wanted someone who could manage his complex household. Her isolation from family, her workaholic tendencies, her loneliness, these were not obstacles to overcome, but vulnerabilities to exploit. Carolyn sat in her small apartment with the evidence spread around her and felt the full weight of her own blindness. She had spent years catching financial criminals, but she had not seen the one living in her own home. Bennett called with news that shifted everything. We have a court date, he said. The judge denied Preston's emergency guardianship petition. We are going to a full hearing. Caroline exhaled. That is good news, right? It means we have a chance. Bennett said, but Preston's legal team will have time to prepare, and they have resources we cannot match. I have new evidence, Caroline said. She told him about Vivian, about the flash drive, about the documents showing years of premeditation. Bennett was quiet for a long moment. That could change everything, he said, but we need to verify authenticity, and we need to be careful about how we present it. Evidence from a hostile witness can be challenged. She is not a hostile witness anymore. Carolyn said, she is a woman who realized she was being used. Bennett agreed to review the materials. In the meantime, Caroline focused on the one thing she could control, preparing her testimony. The knock on her apartment door came on a Wednesday afternoon. Caroline opened it, expecting Bennett or perhaps a delivery. She found instead a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested old money and older expectations. Martha Harrington, Preston's mother. May I come in? Martha said. It was not really a question. Caroline stepped aside, her mind racing through possibilities. Martha had never liked her, had made that clear from their first meeting. Whatever brought her here could not be good. Martha surveyed the small apartment with an expression that was difficult to read. Then she turned to face Caroline directly. I know what my son is, she said. I raised him. I made him. Caroline waited. His father was the same. Martha's voice was flat, controlled, charming in public, cruel in private. I stayed for 30 years because I believed it was my duty, because I had nowhere else to go, because I told myself the children needed their father. Why are you telling me this? Because I watched Preston become his father, and I did nothing to stop it. Martha met her eyes. I told myself it was not my business, that you were an adult who made her own choices, that whatever happened between you was not my concern. She reached into her purse and withdrew a folder. These are documents from Preston's father's psychiatric treatment, she said. Sealed records that show a pattern of behavior going back generations. Manipulation, financial control, manufactured instability in partners. Caroline took the folder with trembling hands. There is also something else. Martha said. She produced another document. Text messages between Preston and Vivian. Communications that prove the affair began before your pregnancy, not after. Why are you giving this to me? Because I will not let him do to my grandchild what his father did to him. Martha's voice finally cracked. Preston was not born cruel. He was made that way. By a father who treated people as possessions, by a mother who looked the other way. She straightened her shoulders. If you need me to testify, I will testify against my own son, because that child deserves a chance to become something better than the Harrington legacy. Carolyn stared at the woman who had been cold and distant throughout her entire marriage. The mother-in-law who had criticized her clothes, her career, her decision to postpone children. Thank you, Caroline said. Martha nodded once. Do not thank me, she said. When? Chapter 6. Word count 828 words. Running total 6412 words. Status under target. Expanding chapter. Done. The night before the trial, Caroline could not sleep. She lay in her small bed in her small apartment and reviewed every piece of evidence in her mind. The financial records, the psychiatric evaluation, the flash drive from Vivian, the documents from Martha, the prenuptial agreement with its hidden traps. Bennett had built a strong case, stronger than either of them had expected when this began. But Preston had expensive lawyers and a lifetime of practice manipulating systems to his advantage. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You should have signed the papers when you had the chance. Now I am going to take everything, including her. Preston already thought of the baby as his property, already assumed it was a girl, already planned the ownership transfer. Caroline did not respond. She deleted the message and turned off her phone. In the morning, she dressed in the most professional outfit she owned, one she had purchased with her first paycheck from her first real job. Before Preston, before any of this. It still fit, barely, stretched over her pregnant belly. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she recognized. Not the trophy wife, not the victim, the forensic accountant who had put criminals in prison. The woman who was about to do it again. She met Bennett outside the courthouse. He looked tired but focused, his briefcase stuffed with documents and notes. Are you ready? He asked. Caroline looked up at the courthouse steps, at the reporters already gathering, at the life she was about to reclaim. I have been ready for years, she said. I just forgot. They walked into the courthouse together, and Caroline did not look back. The courtroom was smaller than Caroline had expected and more intimidating. Dark wood paneling absorbed sound and light, creating an atmosphere of solemn judgment. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, curious spectators, and people who simply wanted to watch a wealthy family tear itself apart. Caroline took her place at the plaintiff's table. Bennett beside her. Across the aisle, Preston sat with his legal team, 4 lawyers in matching expensive suits, led by Douglas Mercer, a man known throughout the state for destroying opponents. Preston looked up and caught her eye. He smiled the smile she had once found charming, the smile she now recognized as a predator's display of teeth. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Theodore Whitmore, presiding. Caroline froze. The name hit her like a physical blow. Whitmore, her father's name, her name, before marriage. She looked at the bench as the judge entered, gray-haired, stern, older than she remembered but unmistakable. The man who had walked out of her life 20 years ago was about to preside over the case that would determine her future. Theodore Whitmore took his seat and surveyed the courtroom. His eyes passed over Caroline without recognition. Perhaps he did not know. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps the universe had a cruel sense of humor. Caroline forced herself to breathe. She could not think about this now. She had to focus. The opening statements began. Douglas Mercer rose with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case that mattered. Your Honor, he said, this is a simple matter complicated by emotion. My client is a devoted husband who has done everything possible to support a wife experiencing severe mental distress during pregnancy. The evidence will show that Mrs. Harrington has exhibited paranoid behavior, made unfounded accusations, and fled the marital home without cause. Mr. Harrington seeks only what is best for his wife and his unborn child. Caroline listened to her life being rewritten, every fact twisted, every truth inverted. In Mercer's version, she was the villain, Preston was the victim, and concern was just another word for control. Bennett rose to respond. His voice was steady, his delivery measured. Your Honor, he said, the defense would have you believe this is about mental illness. It is not. This is about power. The evidence will show a systematic pattern of financial abuse, manufactured instability, and premeditated control. Mrs. Harrington was a forensic accountant who caught criminals for a living. She documented everything. Today, we will show you exactly what she found. The first witness was the psychiatrist, Dr. Whitfield. Douglas Mercer led him through a careful recitation of his credentials and conclusions. The words paranoid ideation and delusional beliefs filled the courtroom like poison gas. Then Bennett cross-examined Dr. Whitfield. Bennett said, How many sessions did you conduct with Mrs. Harrington? One session. Bennett repeated. And in that one session, who else was present? Her husband. And who referred Mrs. Harrington to your practice? Her husband. Bennett nodded slowly. So you formed your conclusion about a patient's mental state based on one session where the supposed source of her stress was sitting in the room. And he was also the person who chose you as her doctor. Dr. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. That is a simplification. Is it? Bennett turned to the judge. Your Honor, we submit records showing that Dr. Whitfield has received consulting payments from Harrington Development Group totaling $47,000 over the past 18 months. The courtroom murmured. Preston's jaw tightened. Judge Whitmore made a note. Proceed, he said. The afternoon brought Vivian Caldwell to the stand. She testified about her relationship with Preston, about the payments she had received, about the documents she had copied. Her voice was flat, her manner detached, like someone reciting facts about another person's life. Douglas Mercer attacked her credibility viciously. Miss Caldwell, he said, you are here because Mr. Harrington ended your relationship. Correct, I am here because I saw what he really is, Vivian said. Mercer smiled, a scorned mistress trying to hurt the man who rejected her. How convenient. Vivian did not flinch. Believe what you want, she said. The documents speak for themselves. The day ended without resolution. Judge Whitmore announced a recess until the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, Carolyn remained in her seat, watching her father gather his papers. He still had not acknowledged her, still had not shown any sign of recognition. She did not know if that made things better or worse. Bennett touched her shoulder. We did well today, he said. Tomorrow we present the financial evidence. That is where we win. Caroline nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. On a man she had not seen in 2 decades. On a father who had abandoned his family without explanation. On the strange coincidence that had placed him in judgment over her life. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, everything changes. Chapter 7, word count at 846 words. Running total 584 words. Status under target. Expanding chapter. That night, Caroline could not stop thinking about her father. She had been 12 when Theodore Whitmore left. She remembered the morning, clearly her mother crying at the kitchen table, her father's car pulling out of the driveway, the feeling that everything stable in her world had suddenly turned to sand. Her mother had never explained why, just that Daddy had to go away, just that sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they love, just that they would be fine, the two of them, even though nothing felt fine at all. Carolyn had buried the pain so deep it became foundation rather than wound. She built her career on precision and evidence, on proving things with documents and numbers, on never trusting anything that could not be verified. She had chosen a husband who seemed safe, who seemed solid, who seemed nothing like the father who had disappeared. But she had been wrong about Preston. Perhaps she had been wrong about Theodore too. Perhaps some patterns repeated no matter how hard you tried to escape them. She pulled out her phone and searched for her father's name. Theodore Whitmore. Retired federal judge. The results were extensive decades of cases, a reputation for fairness, a career ended by choice rather than scandal. Nothing in his biography suggested why he had abandoned his family. Nothing explained the silence. Caroline looked at the photo attached to one article, an older man with tired eyes and a careful expression. She searched for herself in his features and found nothing she recognized. Tomorrow she would stand in his courtroom and fight for her life. And he would judge her without knowing who she was. Or worse, he would know and pretend otherwise. Either way, she had to be ready. She closed her phone and tried to sleep, dreaming of courtrooms and custody papers and the sound of her father's car driving away forever. The second day of trial began with Martha Harrington taking the stand. Preston's face went white when his mother was called as a witness for the plaintiff. He whispered urgently to Douglas Mercer, who rose immediately. Objection. Your Honor, this witness was not on the original list. Judge Whitmore looked at Bennett. Response: the witness came forward with new evidence after the initial disclosure deadline. Bennett said, we filed an amended list 48 hours ago per court rules. Judge Whitmore considered. I will allow it, he said, but counsel will keep questioning relevant. Martha walked to the stand like a woman approaching her own execution. She did not look at her son as she was sworn in. Bennett began gently. Mrs. Harrington, what is your relationship to the defendant? Preston is my son, and you are here today to testify against him. Why Martha took a breath. Because I raised a man who learned cruelty from his father. Because I watched the same pattern destroy my marriage. Because I will not watch it destroy my grandchild. The courtroom was utterly silent. Can you describe this pattern? Bennett asked. Martha detailed the Harrington family history. A controlling patriarch who isolated his wife and manipulated his children. Financial restrictions disguised as protection. Psychiatric interventions weaponized against anyone who objected. I stayed for 30 years, she said. I told myself it was for the children. I told myself it was my duty. I watched my son become his father, and I said nothing. Objection. Mercer called out. This is speculation and character assassination. Your Honor. Bennett said, the witness is establishing pattern evidence directly relevant to the plaintiff's claims. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. Overruled. Continue. Martha produced the documents she had given Caroline. Medical records, text messages, a paper trail of abuse stretching back generations. I am not here to destroy my son, she said finally. I am here to save my grandchild from becoming what he became. What I let him become. Preston was on his feet. This is lies, he shouted. She is senile. She does not know what she is saying. Mr. Harrington, Judge Whitmore said sharply, you will sit down and remain silent. Preston ignored him. You cannot believe her. She is just trying to hurt me because she always hated that I was more successful than my father. The bailiff moved forward. Preston's lawyers tried to pull him back into his seat, but something had broken in him. Some wall of composure he had maintained throughout the proceedings. I built everything. Preston shouted. The company, the wealth, the family name, and now you want to take it away. You want to give it to her. He pointed at Carolyn, his face twisted with rage. She is nothing. She was nothing when I found her, and she will be nothing when I am done with her. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel. Mr. Harrington, you are in contempt of court. One more outburst and you will be removed. Preston finally fell silent, but the damage was done. The gallery had seen him without his mask. The reporters had their headline. The judge had witnessed exactly who he was. When court resumed after a recess, Douglas Mercer attempted to recover. Your Honor, he said, my client is under extreme stress due to concerns for his unborn child. His emotional reaction should not be held against him. Judge Whitmore's expression remained neutral. What should be held against him, he said, is the evidence. Mercer took a breath and played his final card. Your Honor, we would like to present a document that supersedes all other considerations in this case. The original prenuptial agreement signed by both parties before their marriage. He handed copies to the judge and to Bennett. Caroline watched her lawyer's face fall as he read. As you can see, Mercer continued, the agreement contains a morality clause. Any party who files for divorce without demonstrable cause forfeits all claims to marital assets and custody rights. Since Mr. Harrington filed first, and since Mrs. Harrington has failed to prove abuse to the legal standard, the agreement clearly favors my client. Carolyn's vision blurred toward. She remembered signing the document. Vaguely, buried in a stack of wedding paperwork. Preston had said it was just a formality. He had said all wealthy families required them. She had not read it carefully. She had trusted him. Bennett objected, arguing that financial abuse was demonstrable cause. Mercer countered that the evidence was circumstantial. The argument went back and forth while Caroline sat paralyzed. Finally, Judge Whitmore raised his hand for silence. I will review this document carefully, he said. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As Caroline left the courtroom, Preston caught her arm in the hallway. You should have signed when you had the chance, he whispered. Now I am going to take everything, and you are going to watch. He walked away, surrounded by his lawyers, his confidence restored. Bennett put his hand on her shoulder. We will find a way around this, he said. We are not done. But his voice lacked conviction, and Caroline could feel hope slipping away like sand through her fingers. Sound. Chapter 8, word count 919 words. Running total 831 words. Status under target. Expanding chapter. Ja. Carolyn spent that night in her apartment, staring at the prenuptial agreement until the words blurred. The morality clause was elegant in its cruelty, designed to seem mutual, but crafted entirely for Preston's protection. The definition of cause was narrow, requiring criminal conviction for abuse, not mere evidence. The forfeiture provisions were absolute. Preston had laid this trap before he even proposed. He had known, even then, that eventually she would try to leave. And he had made sure that when she did, she would have nothing. Bennett called at midnight with grim news. "I have been researching the document," he said. "The law firm that drafted it closed 15 years ago. The senior partner was a man named Theodore Whitmore." Carolyn went cold. "That is my father. Your father was a lawyer before he was a judge. I did not know." Caroline said, "My mother never talked about his career. I was 12 when he left." "This is a conflict of interest," Bennett said. "If your father is presiding over a case that involves a contract he drafted, the entire proceeding could be invalidated. Is that good or bad for us? I do not know." Bennett admitted, "It depends on whether the conflict favors you or Preston. If your father recuses himself, we get a new judge who might be less sympathetic. If he stays and rules against you, Preston could appeal based on bias." Carolyn thought about the man she had not seen in 20 years, the man who had not recognized her in his own courtroom. "Maybe he does not know," she said. "Maybe he does not realize who I am." "Maybe," Bennett said. "Or maybe he does know and has been waiting to see how it plays out." Neither option felt comforting. Caroline hung up and sat in the darkness, her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. She had spent so long running from her father's abandonment that she had never considered he might reappear. Now he held her fate in his hands, and she did not know if that was salvation or damnation. Tomorrow, she would find out. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread about the prenuptial agreement. Reporters filled every available seat. The gallery buzzed with whispered speculation. Judge Theodore Whitmore entered and took his place on the bench. He looked older than he had the day before, Carolyn thought, as if the weight of something had settled on his shoulders overnight. "Before we proceed," the judge said, "I have some matters to address." The courtroom fell silent. "I have reviewed the prenuptial agreement submitted by the defense," he continued. "In the course of that review, I made a discovery that I must disclose to this court." Douglas Mercer shifted in his seat. "The agreement was drafted by Whitmore and Associates, a firm that closed 15 years ago," the judge said. "The senior partner of that firm was myself." Gasps rippled through the gallery. "That is not all," Judge Whitmore continued. His voice was steady, but Caroline could see something trembling beneath the surface. "The plaintiff in this case is Caroline Whitmore, my biological daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's face went slack with shock. The reporters scribbled frantically. Even Bennett looked stunned. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I did not recognize her at first," he said quietly. "She was 12 when I last saw her. 20 years. I convinced myself it was coincidence, that there were many people with that name, that it could not possibly be her." He looked directly at Caroline for the first time. "I was wrong," he said, "and I should have disclosed this immediately. For that, I apologize to this court." Caroline felt tears burning in her eyes. Not from reconciliation, from something more complicated. Grief and anger and a strange kind of vindication all tangled together. However, Judge Whitmore continued, "Before I recuse myself, there is something I must enter into the record." "Objection," Douglas Mercer called out. "This is highly irregular. Sit down." "Mr. Mercer," Judge Whitmore said, "you will have your chance to appeal." He turned to address the courtroom. "I drafted the morality clause in that prenuptial agreement," he said. "I know its language intimately because I wrote it, and I know its fatal flaw." He held up the document. "The clause applies only if divorce is filed without cause. The definition of cause in this document specifically includes, and I quote, financial manipulation resulting in material harm to one party. The evidence presented in this case, specifically the transfer of funds from Mrs. Harrington's personal account to third parties without her knowledge or consent, constitutes exactly this definition." Preston stood. "That is interpretation," he shouted. "That is bias. It is contract law," Judge Whitmore replied. "I wrote the clause to protect wives from exactly the kind of behavior you have exhibited. I never imagined my own daughter would need that protection." He turned to Carol. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "I made choices 20 years ago that I can never undo, but I will not compound those mistakes by allowing an injustice in my courtroom." He gathered his papers. "I am recusing myself from final judgment," he said, "but the findings of fact I have entered into the record will stand. The prenuptial agreement is voidable due to the documented financial abuse. I recommend my successor rule accordingly. He stood to leave, then paused. Carolyn, he said, his voice cracked slightly. When this is over, if you are willing, I would like to explain. You deserve that much. He left the bench without waiting for a response. The courtroom erupted into chaos. I am. Chapter 9. Word count 632 words. Running total 9. 810 words. Status under target. Expanding chapter significantly. Oh. A new judge was brought in within 2 hours. Judge Patricia Winters, a severe woman with gray hair and no patience for drama. She reviewed the record, the evidence, and Judge Whitmore's findings with methodical precision. The courtroom waited in tense silence. I have reviewed everything, Judge Winters said finally. The evidence of financial abuse is clear and well documented. The psychiatric evaluation has been discredited. The testimony of multiple witnesses supports the plaintiff's account. She turned to Preston. Mr. Harrington, she said, you have failed to rebut the established pattern of control, financial concealment, and unilateral decision-making. Your conduct during these proceedings has demonstrated exactly the behavior Mrs. Harrington described. Preston opened his mouth to respond, but Douglas Mercer gripped his arm. The prenuptial agreement is hereby voided, Judge Winters continued. Due to procedural defects and failure of disclosure, the morality clause, as Judge Whitmore correctly noted, does not apply when cause has been demonstrated. She looked at Caroline. Mrs. Harrington, she said, your request for relief is granted. Caroline felt the words wash over her like warm water. Months of fear and isolation dissolving in a single sentence. This court orders the following. Judge Winters continued, all frozen accounts will be restored to Mrs. Harrington immediately. Mr. Harrington will pay compensatory damages in the amount of $210,000, representing the funds illegally transferred from Mrs. Harrington's personal accounts. Preston went pale. Additionally, Judge Winters said, Mr. Harrington's custody petition is denied. Mrs. Harrington will have sole decision-making authority regarding the child. Mr. Harrington may petition for visitation rights after a period of supervised evaluation. The judge made a final note. The matter of undisclosed transfers and potential financial fraud is referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation, she said. This court does not have jurisdiction over criminal matters, but the evidence suggests further review is warranted. She set down her pen. This hearing is concluded, she said, and struck her gavel. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Caroline sat motionless as the room erupted around her. Reporters rushed for exits. Spectators burst into conversation. Bennett was shaking her hand and saying something she could not quite hear, but she was watching Preston. He sat rigid in his chair, staring straight ahead. His lawyers gathered papers around him. His mother was already gone, slipped out during the ruling. For the first time since she had met him, Preston Harrington III looked small, powerless, afraid. He must have felt her gaze because he turned and met her eyes. This is not over, he said quietly. His voice was cold but broken. You will regret this. Carolyn stood slowly, one hand on her belly, the other on the table that had held her evidence. No, she said, I will not. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The hallway outside the courtroom was a wall of cameras and shouted questions. Carolyn walked through them like a woman moving through water, aware of the chaos but not part of it. Mrs. Harrington, do you have a statement, Carolyn? What do you say to women in similar situations? Did you know your father would be the judge? Bennett shielded her as best he could. No comments at this time, he repeated. My client needs rest. They made it to a side exit where Bennett had arranged a car. Caroline slid into the back seat and watched the courthouse shrink behind her. How do you feel? Bennett asked. Caroline considered the question. Tired, she said. Relieved. Strange. You won, Bennett said. Against all odds, you won. We won, Caroline corrected. I could not have done this without you. Bennett smiled, and for the first time since they met, he looked his age. Young, hopeful, satisfied with a job well done. What happens now? Caroline asked. Now you rebuild, Bennett said. You have your money back. You have your freedom. You have your child. Everything else is up to you. The car took her to her small apartment, which no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a beginning. 3 months later, Caroline held her daughter for the first time. The delivery had been difficult, but the baby was healthy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with surprising focus. Caroline named her Hope, not because she believed in happy endings, but because she wanted her daughter to know that some things were worth fighting for. Dorothy came to visit the day after the birth. She stood in the doorway of the hospital room with flowers and tears and apologies spilling out faster than Caroline could process. "I am so sorry," Dorothy said. "I should have been braver. I should have stood by you. You were protecting your children." Caroline said, "I understand." Dorothy sat beside the bed and looked at the baby in Caroline's arms. "She is beautiful," Dorothy said. "She is free," Caroline replied. "That is what matters." The weeks that followed brought changes Caroline had not anticipated. Preston was indicted on 12 counts of financial fraud. The investigation triggered by Judge Winters uncovered years of illegal activity far beyond what Caroline had documented. Shell companies, tax evasion, stolen funds from his own investors. His bail was set at $5 million. His assets were frozen pending trial. The Harrington name, synonymous with wealth and respectability for 3 generations, became a punchline on evening news broadcasts. Vivian Caldwell disappeared from public life. Her consulting company folded. Her professional reputation was destroyed. The last Caroline heard, she had moved to another state to start over. Caroline did not gloat. Vivian had made her own choices, and those choices had consequences. That was enough. Martha Harrington reached out through a lawyer to request a meeting with her granddaughter. Caroline agreed, cautiously. They met at a park near Caroline's new home, Martha holding Hope with trembling hands and tears running down her weathered face. "I am sorry," Martha said, "for all of it, for raising him the way I did, for not stopping it sooner. You stopped it when it mattered." Caroline said. Martha looked at Hope's sleeping face. "She deserves better than the Harrington legacy." She said, "She will have it," Caroline replied. The meeting with her father was harder. Theodore Whitmore came to her apartment on a Saturday afternoon by invitation. He stood in the doorway like a man awaiting judgment, which Caroline supposed he was. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. Caroline led him to the living room where Hope slept in a bassinet. Theodore looked at his granddaughter for a long moment without speaking. "She has your mother's nose," he said finally. "You left," Caroline said, without explanation, without goodbye. "I spent 20 years wondering what I did wrong." Theodore sat down heavily. "You did nothing wrong," he said. "The marriage was falling apart. Your mother and I had destroyed each other. She thought it would be easier for you if I just disappeared." "Easier," Caroline repeated. "I know now how wrong that was." Theodore said, "I told myself I was protecting you from the ugliness of divorce. The truth is I was running from my own failure. You wrote that prenuptial agreement." Caroline said, "The one Preston used against me." Theodore nodded. "That was 25 years ago." He said, "Standard boilerplate for wealthy clients. I never imagined my own daughter would need its protection, but it did protect me." Caroline said, "The way you drafted it, I wish I could claim that was intentional." Theodore said, "The truth is I built that clause to protect wives from controlling husbands because I had seen too many of them. I just never thought my own child would marry one." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by blood and separated by decades. "I am not asking for forgiveness," Theodore said. "I do not deserve it. I am asking for a chance to know my granddaughter, to make whatever amends are possible." Caroline looked at her father, at the lines on his face and the regret in his eyes. "I cannot promise anything," she said, "but you can start by being here, by showing up, by not running away when things get hard." Theodore nodded. "That is fair," he said. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a beginning, which was more than either of them had expected. 6 months later, Carolyn walked through a park near her home. Hope was in a stroller, babbling at the trees and the birds and the endless wonder of a world still new. She passed a bench where a young woman sat alone, staring at nothing, pregnant, tired, the particular exhaustion of someone carrying weight no one else could see. Caroline paused. "Rough day?" she asked. The young woman looked up, startled. "Rough year," she said. Caroline sat down beside her. She did not ask for details. She did not offer advice. I have been there, she said simply. The young woman laughed bitterly. I doubt it. She said, my husband controls everything. My money, my friends, my schedule. He says it is for my own good, but I feel like I am disappearing. Caroline nodded slowly. I know exactly what that feels like, she said. The young woman turned to look at her. Really, really, Caroline said. And I also know it can get better. Not easily, not quickly, but it can get better. How? The young woman asked. Caroline reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Bennett Shaw's office. The same card that had changed her own life a year ago. Start here, she said. They can help. The young woman took the card with trembling hands. Why are you helping me? She asked. You do not even know me. Carolyn smiled and looked at Hope, who was reaching for a butterfly that had landed on the stroller handle. Because someone helped me, she said, and the only way to repay that is to help someone else. The young woman stared at the card for a long moment. Then she looked up at Caroline with something flickering in her eyes. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope, which was where everything began. Thank you, she whispered. Carolyn stood and pushed Hope's stroller back onto the path. She did not look back because she did not need to. The young woman would make her own choice, walk her own path, fight her own battle. And when she won, because Caroline believed she would win, she would sit on a park bench someday and pass the gift along. That was how it worked. That was how it would always work. Not through grand gestures or perfect endings, but through small acts of kindness passed from one survivor to the next. Carolyn walked home through the golden afternoon light, her daughter laughing at the shadows of leaves on the sidewalk. The past was behind her. The future was uncertain. But the present was hers, fully and completely and forever. And that was enough.